All right. Well, welcome, everybody. It is really lovely to have you here with us this afternoon virtually. We miss seeing everybody in person, of course, but we're happy to have the opportunity to still connect in this virtual space. My name is Tessa Lesage. I'm with Collaboratory, and I'm a future maker. And the FutureMakers Coalition has been doing a series since we've been in lockdown, since COVID really kind of came to Florida and to the US. And the series is about equity through the lens of COVID. COVID-19 has really shed a light on a lot of the challenges that we continue to face related to racism in our country, in our communities. And so we thought it would be nice to bring, people who have different areas of expertise to talk about those areas of expertise and to really help our community explore these issues around equity more, because everyone seems very hungry to learn more right now, which is fantastic. And I think the more we can talk about it, the more comfortable we get with it, the better our community will be. So we're excited to be here with you today. Our topic today is leading with dignity. Before we get started, I want to make sure that you check yourself, right? Because racism is traumatic and it actually affects all of us. It doesn't matter if you're white, black, or brown, all people alike. We carry racism in our heads, hearts, and bodies. And some of the things that we might talk about today may stir up emotions for you. They may be heavy. Sometimes we feel guilt when we hear some of the issues around these topics. So you might even feel defensive or angry, but we're asking you to stick with us. And we're asking you to make sure you take care of yourself, right? Because if we get stuck in any of those emotions, then we can't move forward. So one thing to think about is for you to take a few deep cleansing breaths. And you can actually do that with us here now. So I'm going to ask you to take a deep breath with me. We're going to do 3, okay? Ready? And so let's take it. You can cast your eyes down or turn off your screen if you would like, but let's take a deep breath in. And if you're holding any tension in your jaw, release that as you release your breath. And take another deep breath in. If you're like me and your shoulders are clenched up, go ahead and release those down when you release your breath. And then one more deep breath in and let it out. Okay. So whether it's today in this conversation or in future experiences or conversations, when we're talking about race and racism, if you feel yourself getting triggered, return to your breath. We have to power through these conversations, and doing so requires us taking care of ourselves. All right, so what our objectives are today is we want to have a conversation with you. We want to definitely practice self-care and healing the body from the trauma of racism. We want to tell you briefly about FutureMakers Coalition and why we're having these conversations, and then to explore structural racism through the lens of COVID, to learn about our own implicit biases, and then also to ultimately ignite our collective action and co-create anti-racist systems in Southwest Florida. So FutureMakers' big goal in doing this work is that we sort of rewrite the policies, practices, and beliefs that have gotten us to where we are now. Instead of just amending them or tweaking them here and there, we need to really co-create them together with our community and rewrite the policies to create anti-racist systems in our community. We want a better future. That's why we're ultimately doing this, right? We want quality housing, home ownership, integrated neighborhoods, good paying jobs, and benefits that minimize wealth disparities. We want to ensure people have access to high quality healthcare. And we want education and equitable outcomes for all, and we want a fair justice system. So the thing that we've really been working on with our equity work, the equity action team of the FutureMakers Coalition, is creating a brave space, whether it's in a room together or we're here virtually, or, you know, the big goal would be to create a brave space within our community where we can continue these conversations. So, you know, we're having some conversations just about structural racism and implicit bias in general, so that people start to feel more comfortable using the words, so that we can actually move forward with these conversations, so we can understand and all sort of have the same foundation of where we're starting from with this work. But for here today, let's just start with creating a brave space here. You know, we acknowledge that inequity plays out in a lot of spaces, whether it's gender identity, sexuality, citizenship, citizenship status, socioeconomic status, physical ability, race, ethnicity, the list goes on and on. So if we don't talk about all of those, please know that we recognize that and we honor everybody. And let's just create this as a brave space. If someone says something, it's okay to disagree, but we're going to be, I know everyone will be, but we're going to be respectful, and we're going to really practice trying to understand other people's perspectives. So real quick about FutureMakers. So FutureMakers Coalition is a fantastic example of some of the things that we can do when we work together across organizations, across jurisdictional boundaries. I'm very, very proud of it. FutureMakers Coalition is really not a nonprofit, it's a network. It's unlike any other nonprofit you've ever seen. We're working with one sole goal in mind, and that's to transform Southwest Florida's workforce. We want to increase the number of working age adults, people who are 25 to 64, that have a credential beyond a high school diploma here in Southwest Florida. We know that by the year 2025, more than 60% of the jobs in Florida will require a credential beyond a high school diploma. Here in Southwest Florida, we're behind the country, we're behind the state in terms of how skilled our workforce is when it comes to credentials. Right now, we're only at about 41%, 41.2% of Southwest Floridians who are in that working age that have a credential beyond a high school diploma. What that means is that we have jobs that go unfilled all the time. These are better paying jobs. These are jobs that if we could fill them, our businesses would grow, our economy would become stronger, and people would have a more sustainable and resilient career pathway. Not to mention the fact that then those people who are the parents of our children who are in our current school district would no longer have their children in a position of being first generation college students, right? Their parents would be in a different place. So it would be generational change by helping people to earn a credential and fill those jobs. So that is FutureMakers' big goal. 2025 is very close. 41.2% is far away from 55%, but we are determined to get there. It is not impossible, and if we work together, we can do it. The good news is that since FutureMakers started, we've added almost 31,000 credentials workers to Southwest Florida. That's very good. These are people who are staying. This is not the 23-year-old who graduates from FGCU and moves to Tampa. This is 25 to 64-year-olds. So 31,000 is pretty darn good. But with population change and some of the other challenges we face, this is really what the trend looks like. So the red line is our goal of 55%, and the black line shows you our progress. So population growth plays a big role in this, but still we're not making enough progress quickly enough. And what we have found within our work is that we've really started to take our outcomes, and we run on data. FutureMakers runs on data. Our reports are all on our website. But we have outcomes all the way from cradle to career, from kindergarten readiness, so that's early childhood education, all the way through the untapped workforce that's out there right now that doesn't have a credential beyond high school. We work that whole system. We're trying to create a sustainable talent pipeline. Our outcomes, when we have disaggregated them by race and ethnicity all along that talent pipeline, we have noticed that there are gaps depending on your race or your ethnicity. So the system appears to be designed and working best for white students. And so we have to address that to close those gaps in order to meet our workforce goals. And I'm going to give you one more piece of information before I turn this over to our fantastic speaker, who I am so excited about having today. About 40% of the students right now in our K through 12 system are white. 40. That's less than half. That means that if we don't figure out how to rewrite our policies and practices and change our beliefs about people of color, whether they're intentional or unintentional. If we don't figure that out, we won't even get closer to our goal of 55%. It will go down because more than 50% of the students in the K through 12 system in Southwest Florida right now are students of color. They're not white, and the system does not appear to be working as well for them. So this is, it's a human rights issue, it's a quality of life issue, but it's also an economic development issue. Our businesses need workforce, so it behooves us to close the gaps on these outcome disparities. All right, so I get excited. Next up, I'm so excited. I know a lot of you know our speaker. We just love her and miss her so much here in Southwest Florida. But it is my pleasure to introduce, if you do not know Yemisi Oloruntola Coates earned her bachelor's degree in speech communication at Hofstra University and a master's degree in strategic global communication management at the University of Florida. In 2014, she graduated with distinction, magna cum laude, for academic achievement and was awarded the Fulbright Hays Fellowship to study international relations focused on monetary unions, economic stability, and Yoruba culture in West Africa. She worked in Japan with the Japanese consulate, which helped in shaping an understanding of the role that diversity plays within organizations. Yemisi has 15 years of experience in diversity, equity, and inclusion. She has led DEI initiatives for large health systems. She's currently a Bay State Health Systems Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. Her responsibilities focus on the direction and implementation of Bay State Systems diversity and inclusion strategy. This includes developing and implementing diversity and inclusion programs, culturally responsive care strategies, training, recruitment, and improving the organization's ability to attract and retain a diverse and inclusive workforce. Previously, Yemisi was the System Director of Diversity and Patient Care at Lee Health, woohoo, for 11 years. At Lee Health, her role focused on what she defines as the 4 C's: caring people, Lee Health employees, corporate social responsibility, community engagement, and patient care, culturally and linguistically appropriate services in healthcare. Her work at Lee Health largely focused on a tagline she developed: diversely, putting diversity and inclusion into practice. She served on the editorial board for Lee Health's Nursing Matters magazine and wrote the diversity column and served on the editorial board for the News Press, one of the largest newspaper publications in Southern Florida. She has contributed to many articles focused on diversity topics at the News Press, Gulf Shore Business, American College of Healthcare Executives, Florida Weekly, Health Research and Educational Trust, and the National Diversity Council. Yemisi has published research in academic and clinical journals. Her most recent publication is How D&I Strategies Enhance Organizational Readiness for Global Nursing Recruitment. She is the first non-clinical person to present at the Francine Gomberg Nursing Research Program on her readability study for surgical consent forms. Yemisi received the Corporate Diversity of Excellence Award and 40 Under 40 by Gulf Shore Business. Under her leadership, Lee Health was awarded by Forbes magazine as Best Employer for Diversity and for Women in 2017 and Best Employer for Diversity in 2018. Yemisi is a member of the director of the board of the Western chapter of the American College of Healthcare Executives, serves on the board of directors at Leadership Pioneer Valley, is on the diversity committee for Dress for Success, East Longmeadow School District, and for American College of Healthcare Executives. A member of the Western Massachusetts Jack and Jill organization, a steering committee member for Bay State Education Research and Scholarship of Teaching, and serves on the Diversity Inclusion Executive Council for the Conference Board, a nonprofit business and global think tank. She recently launched Bay State Health community response team in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Yemisi is a national and regional speaker on diversity topics, and we couldn't love her more here in Southwest Florida. It's my pleasure to turn it over to you, Yemisi. Thanks for being with us today.
Wow, Tessa, that was a lot. It feels strange when you hear it yourself versus when you see it on paper. I appreciate, of course, I love Southwest Florida, and it's so exciting to see so many familiar faces. I see Sunny's face, I see Gwinetta's face. So I'm really appreciative of this time. So thank you so much for inviting me. And so when I met with Tessa a couple of months ago, she wanted me to talk about, as she mentioned and explained, equity in action and how we are dealing with COVID plus racial injustice in the country. And so I'm going to take you on a journey that Bay State recently embarked on, and this is one of the series called Leading with Dignity. But before I go into Leading with Dignity, next slide, please. I want to talk about the perfect storm, if you can click again. I don't know if you ever watched the movie The Perfect Storm. It was actually based in Massachusetts. And when you think about where we are today, you have COVID-19, you have racial injustice, another pandemic, you have education pandemic, and then you have the economic pandemic, all colliding at the same time. And then you can also add the political pandemic. There's been so much massive change in just a matter of months. So we are in a perfect storm. And although this picture looks extremely scary, and pretty much if you think about all of these things coming together, this is what we're dealing with. But we have an opportunity to really take this storm and perfect it and make a change. And so one of the changes that occurred, if you go into the next slide, is structural racism is now a public health crisis. Within in the state of Massachusetts, all the health system publicly stated that racism is a public health crisis. And not just in Massachusetts, this is across the nation that people are realizing the impact, particularly on Black bodies, Black male bodies. And so they're taking a holistic approach, and with COVID-19 really impacting people of color mostly, although COVID-19 has impacted everybody, as Tessa mentioned earlier on, but disproportionately people of color because of the very word that is listed on top of this screen, because of the structure. And so one of the things in terms of how we deal with this is, you have the practices and the policies and the way we need to look at and uncover things that needs to be changed. But also there's the human aspect. And that is where Leading with Dignity comes into play. Next slide. And so this is where you have participation. And I'm gonna give you a case scenario. This is actually a true case scenario. And I would love for either you type in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, that is absolutely fine. So I'm gonna read this scenario to you right now. You notice that there is a Black Lives Matter poster hanging in the communal area of your organization. Your employee that puts it up informs you that they did it in order for you to notice. Next, if you can click. Why do you think the employee put it up for the manager to notice? To start a conversation, okay, Jen, yep. To start a conversation, anything else, anybody else? As a test, okay, Gwinnetta, as a test, that's possible. Anyone else? Because I didn't feel comfortable saying something directly, absolutely, that could be. They probably felt like their manager didn't acknowledge the feelings of the employee in the current time. Very good point as well. Excellent. And so I have another follow-up question. What message was the employee trying to convey? So you kind of answered it in some of your responses. I saw that in the last response, I believe it was Milana, she said they probably felt like their manager did not acknowledge the feelings of the employee in the current climate. That could possibly be true. What else do you think the employee was trying to convey? This is an issue. We need to talk about it. Yes, Julie Pedretti, absolutely. This is an issue. Anything else? The issue would be, see me. Yes, see me. The issue would be the fear of an employee to respond for fear of being branded. Very excellent point there too. And yeah, see me, time for action. Absolutely. Next question, please. And so I would like to know, how would you have responded? If this was your employee, what would you have done to respond to this case scenario? I know, I see. Start the conversation right there. Yes, start the conversation right there. Listen, lead the discussion with the team. Absolutely. Ask questions as to what positive steps can be taken to address the issue and engage in dialogue. Absolutely. These are really, really great steps. Any others? I see some people look like they're typing. If it didn't come from a previous group discussion, it may not be well accepted to start the conversation and let people know that they were okay to answer. That is possible, absolutely. That is absolutely possible. Well, I want to tell you how this happened. So this actually happened at Bay State. If you can go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to tell you how a manager responded with dignity. Okay, so as you can see, some of the words you used, you see human dignity is in the middle. You have legitimacy, you know, you matter. You have inclusion, you matter. You have accountability, you matter. All of that connecting piece. So I had a manager who contacted my office along with the employee relations, and that happened. The first thing was, this happened soon after George Floyd. So you're talking about a couple of days after. She, will be able to get this presentation? Yes, you can get the presentation, Granetta. Yes. And so he said, you know, we have a policy because part of our hospital is unionized. And so we have a policy that we can't put signages up. So he was focused more on the policy than the person, right? But also he was afraid. He said, I'm a white male from Pittsfield. Pittsfield, Massachusetts is a predominantly white area. And he said, I've never had to deal with something like this. So first, I thanked him for his honesty. Second, I thanked him for reaching out to the department. Third, we went through what is called the dignity model. And I'm going to go through that with you. We went through the dignity model and I shared certain elements of the dignity model. The dignity model was created by Dr. Donna Hicks. She's a Harvard professor. And what she studied was, why do countries war? Why do countries have conflict? So she talked about these 10 essential elements of dignity. I shared with him the elements of dignity. And he said to me, oh my gosh, I realized that I did not take the time to talk to her. He said, I was too nervous and scared to have a conversation. I've never had a conversation about race. And so he didn't know how to manage it. But the dignity model, as we went through the steps, which you're gonna see what those steps are, he was able to have language on how to respond. And he said, can I make it right? Can I make it right? I said, yes, you can make it right. But I asked him certain questions. This employee, has she ever done anything like this before? He said, no. Because at first he thought it was behavioral, that she was having issues. I said, has she ever been late before? He said, no. I said, when did she start being late? When did she start acting differently? He said, post George Floyd. I said, do you see the pattern of what's going on? Did you address the conversation? Because at that time, I wrote a message for the organization. The CEO also wrote a message. I said, did you share it with your team? He said, no. So I said, did you have a meeting with your team? He said, yes. Did you talk about what happened at all? He said, no, I didn't feel comfortable. So I said, do you realize she put that sign up because she wanted to talk? And he's like, I didn't see it that way at that time. And so when we went through the steps, he realized the mistakes he made. He went back to the person and talked to the person using the dignity model. And he said that in his 30 years of career, he's never had a most impactful conversation about something as charged as race in his life. And the relationship between him and his employee not only changed his perspective as a leader, but also changed his approach and how he leads his department. And so I'm going to go with you. I'm going to share with you the dignity model that I shared with him. You can go to the next slide. But before I do that, remember I said he talked about policy. Yes, please. Yeah, click next and next. Yes. He was focused on policy, which is important. But in the conversation, you got to think about people. It's about human-centered design, then policy, not the other way around. And some of the structural racism that we're having is because it doesn't think about the people. It thinks about the policy, what I'm going to gain. But if I gain, if I'm gaining and you're not, I'm taking away. And so this is a whole conversation that we had to go through within the organization. So here is the dignity model that I'm going to share with you. But before I do that, in the next slide, this is a great quote. It comes down to the way you treat people. When you treat people with dignity and respect all the time, you can work through anything. And that's exactly what that manager was able to do. He was able to work through something that was uncomfortable, but he had the language and the tools to engage it. Next slide. So here is the dignity model. So as I said, it has 10 essential elements of dignity: acknowledgement, inclusion, freedom, safety, benefit of doubt, fairness, and accountability. And I'm going to go through each of those with you. Next slide. But first, I want to talk about the difference between respect and dignity. Now, I'm sure all of you have used respect quite a lot in your conversations and how you engage and how you talk about, especially in right now, I respect people. Respect is important. I give respect, or I deserve respect. However, the definition of respect by the Webster Dictionary is showing admiration for someone because of their abilities, qualities, or achievements. Respect is earned. So to me, respect has lost its potency, because respect is based on reciprocity, is based on what I do to earn it, okay? Dignity, Dr. Donna Hicks says, and the Webster definition of dignity is, in Latin, dignitas, which means to be worthy. All people have the right to be recognized for their inherent humanity and treated ethically. Dignity is a given. So regardless of your education, regardless of your economics, regardless of what zip code you live in, regardless of your age, regardless of your religion, regardless of your gender or who you choose to love, you are worthy. That is the difference. And so with the dignity model, what it does, it helps to create a different level of consciousness, and also helps to understand your impact on someone's dignity. What happened to George Floyd? He was not He was on the respect. Oh, you have to do something. So in their mind, he's a black male. He didn't do anything, or he doesn't deserve my admiration. But if he was dignified, he would be treated differently, because regardless of whatever the situation is, he is worthy. And he did not have that dignity. And we can keep going on in the many, many, many situations that have occurred as of late and for years. And so when we go into the next slide, thank you, Tessa. I want to share with you the 10 essential elements of dignity that Dr. Donna Hicks created. And she says, dignity is part of our evolutionary inheritance. The need to be seen in a favorable light, okay, is part of our evolutionary inheritance. So here are the 10 essential elements of dignity. Acceptance of identity. I love this one. First thing you need to do when you want to honor people's dignity, they are neither superior or inferior to you. By virtue of being a human being, we all have the same inherent worth and value, and the same human vulnerability. So she says, regardless of your race, regardless of religion, regardless of your gender, class, or sexual orientation, it is your obligation to humanity to accept them as your spiritual equals and do them no harm. Acknowledgement. People like to feel like they matter. It is important to acknowledge the impact of your actions on others when you violate their dignity, instead of trying to save face or ignore the harm you have caused. Inclusion. No one likes to feel left out. That you question, why wasn't I included? What about me that I wasn't included? This is an affront to our dignity at all levels, from the political, when minority groups feel left out of the political process by the majority, to the interpersonal, when we're not included in the decision-making. Safety. We all know about safety from a physical standpoint, but what about psychological? Honoring others' psychological safety means not shaming, humiliating, diminishing, or hurtfully criticizing them, but not limited to violations that are public. Next slide. Fairness, equity, right? We all have a particularly strong knee-jerk reaction to being treated unfairly. If you want to honor dignity of others, we need to ensure we're honoring agreed upon laws and rules of fairness, structural inclusion, which I will talk about. Freedom. A major dignity violation occurs when we restrict people and try to control their lives. Honoring this element of dignity requires that people feel free from domination. Understanding. There is nothing more frustrating than to feel misunderstood, particularly when you're in conflict with others. Extending dignity means that you give others a chance to explain themselves. Benefit of the doubt. Treating people as though they were trustworthy, giving them the benefit of the doubt, is honoring their dignity. Treating others as though they were trustworthy, as difficult as it is, often interrupts the negative expectations, creating opportunities for change in a relationship. And finally, next slide. Responsiveness. We all want to be seen and heard. Treating people as though they were invisible or ignoring them by not responding to their concerns is a violation of their dignity. Righting the wrong. When we violate someone's dignity, it is important to take responsibility and apologize for the hurt you have caused. And what I love that she says here, she said, is a way for us to regain our own dignity, as well as acknowledging the wrongdoing due to the person you violated. Not only do you regain your dignity by righting the wrong, but they gain their dignity too. And so these are the 10 essential elements of dignity. If you go to the next slide. So knowing what some of the dignity elements, now that I shared with you, which elements of dignity did the manager use in the story? And you can write it in the chat. So you have acceptance of identity, you have acknowledgement, you have understanding, you have responsiveness, you have righting the wrong, you have freedom, You have inclusion. So which one of them makes perfect? Okay, responsiveness. Yes. Okay. Responsiveness, Tessa put that. Okay, yep, definitely. Responsibly, inclusion, yeah, you can say that. Acceptance, yes, acceptance, acknowledgement, that's a good one, absolutely. But what else did he do that was really critical? The last word, responsiveness, and then understanding, because he eventually actually listened and gave a chance to explain, yes. But what did he do? He did it wrong the first time. Yes, Martha. Oh, nice to see you, Martha. Righting the wrong. That is correct. And if you, yep, righting the wrong. So if you could click on, you'll see the answers. And you keep going. Acknowledgement, responsiveness, and righting the wrong. That is what he did. He acknowledged, A, that he messed up. And then he also acknowledged what she was trying to convey. He then responded to her by setting time to talk to her, and he apologized and was vulnerable and told her he was uncomfortable, but now he felt he had the tools and the language to have the dialogue with her. And so when you go to the next slide, please, I want us to watch this video and the look, and I'm gonna ask you some questions after you watch this video. Is everything? Oh, okay, she got it. So what did you think of that video as Tessa goes back to bringing up the PowerPoint slide? When you saw in the beginning as he was navigating his way towards his life and spending time with his son, what did you notice? What stood out to you? Oh, Malana, why do you say you always tear up? What made you tear up when you watched it? The sad fact that some people, that is, yes, it's true. The sad fact that some people have to prove themselves before acceptance. Yes, and that it's true. And body language is a powerful communicator. Yes, you're right, Jen. In fact, Harvard University studied the impact of body language, nonverbal communication, which is actually 90% of our communication. 10% is our words. So the power of how we say it has such a strong meaning and presence than even the word itself. He's seen different in other roles in society when he's not a judge. That is correct. He was seen possibly as a threat, but also, if you look at the other side, you're looking at people looking at him, but think about how he may feel internalized racism in terms of how he feels people are looking at him. Because of the judgment, yes, helps me remind, treat everyone, yes, regardless of possible internal bias. And when you experience it over and over, so that's called race battle fatigue. Race battle fatigue is actually a coined term in which it's almost like PTSD, when people of color are constantly subjected to marginalization of interaction, communication, jobs. And sometimes they have to say, well, did they do this because? It's a constant internal dialogue that they face in every day. Did they talk to me like this? Because? Was I not given this job? Because? All of that is what they carry every day. Am I being followed in the store because I'm Black? All of that is happening. So he could be going through the world feeling, are they looking at me because I'm a Black man? All of those aspects. Yes, it clearly demonstrates jointly held stereotypes. That's correct. And so when you look at the end, when you saw the police officer, what were you thinking? As he walked, because you saw you were following him in his journey. What were you thinking when you saw the police? What was your first instinct? And be honest. He was arrested. Yes, that is, yes. He was a defendant. That's correct. Yes, most people, I appreciate your honesty, Testa and Jen. Yeah, I assumed he was the judge. I was smiling. Well, that's good, Julie. I'm glad that you assume that. But oftentimes that is not the case, that automatically it links to the opposite. But then think about the fact that in the judge room, in the courtroom, that's when he got his respect. But outside of that room, outside of that robe, he didn't get that respect. That is a very powerful thing to experience, because outside the robe, he wasn't wearing the robe as he was walking through the journey and going to the store, he wasn't wearing a robe, and he was treated differently. But within that robe, he got a different experience. And so what we need to do is really change the look, right? We need to change the way we look and interact, particularly with people of color, how we structure, how we do our policies, practices, and algorithms, which I'll talk more about. If you could go into the next slide. Yes, Grenetta, yeah. You have experienced that when you became an elected official, absolutely, and especially since you're the first one. So that is also a heavy weight to always be the first, and the expectations from Black communities and the expectations from majority communities, and having to walk that balance and still be authentic. Yes. To some, I'm different. Absolutely. I understand that. I went through that myself when I moved to Southwest Florida. So I understand that very, very well. And so thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing. And so when we think about what she just mentioned, Gwenetta, which is a perfect segue into the analysis on race in America. So if you look at it, it says the Pew Research did a study in 2019, February. So can you imagine what this study would look like today? They say most say it's now more common for people to express racist or racially insensitive views. If you look at bird watching in New York City, is a perfect example of that. He's a Harvard grad, bird watching, and she weaponized his race and his gender because it was a Black male, which holds a threat status, right? And so, they said that 65% said is more common, especially since Trump was elected. And it has become more common for people to express it outwardly. It's more acceptable, where before people may think about it in their houses, and it may be tea time conversation or dinner time conversation, but not brandishly come out with it and be so open. And then you have, of course, social media, which allows for such a larger platform to really express your views. I have my thoughts around social media. There's pluses and minuses to it. But of course, in this time that we're in, it's just a lot coming at individuals and organizations and people today. If you go into the next slide. And so one of the things that they also analyzed was the difference between how whites and blacks differ in views of how blacks are treated. So if you look at it in dealing with the police, you look at the criminal justice system, you look at in hiring, pay, and promotions, and you look at applying for a mortgage, you look at in stores or restaurants, when voting elections, when seeking medical treatment, you can see the black is in the orange kind of yellow and the white is in the blue. And this also impacts Latino. They felt the same way. There was a disparity, as well as Asians, there was disparity. And so this is where the divide is. And oftentimes it's because one is experiencing it head on and the other one is experiencing from a distance. So there's a disconnect on the reality of what is. However, because of George Floyd, it's created this reckoning within the United States of something you cannot ignore, because the world saw a man not fighting back, not saying, calling for his mother, while a person was smirking with his knee on his neck. And so no one can ignore that for a so-called bounced check, which I believe was worth $20. So his life wasn't worth not even $20. His dignity wasn't worth anything. And so I think it will be interesting to see if the Pew Research would do this analysis today. I believe that it would be much more closely aligned, because I believe that people are seeing it much more differently than they've done in the past. Next slide. And so I want to talk about, when I talk about leading with dignity, one of the things at Based It, as I said, we started Elevating Dignity series in response to George Floyd. And I'm going to share with you some of the things we've been doing since I got to Bay State. But the first thing is diversity is the people, the perspectives, because you have diversity of thought, right? Inclusion is the voice, the power, the organization, the culture, but equity equals impact. That's where we want to be. We've been talking diversity, we've been talking inclusion, we need to get down to the impact. We need to affect policy, practice, position, processes, algorithms. We need to have that impact. Although there has been gains since the 1964 Civil Rights Act, I'm not saying there has not been gains. However, we have not moved the needle, because what we've done is we focused on diversity and inclusion and not changed the structure. The structures have remained, the policies have remained, the practices have remained, and that is why we are where we are today in 2020. And so as we go into the next slide, one of the things that we need to think about is, first, starting with our inner dialogue. And so when you look at this picture, if you can click, what do you see when you see this picture? Tell me what you see. I see some of you smile. Peace, a beautiful life, an angel, yeah. Adorable cuteness, absolutely. Yes, so you see cuteness, an angel, a beautiful life. This is my son, precious baby, thank you. My son, when he was about 5 days old. Thank you, yes, precious baby. And so when you look, you can't look at a baby and not say, oh my gosh, you know, endless possibilities. Yes, Sunny. Yes, beautiful and angelic. Thank you, Martha. Absolutely. No one looks at a baby and says they're not worthy. No one. It doesn't matter what color they are and what race. We look at a baby and it automatically makes you smile. Accepted. Yes. There's something about babies that just helps us to see something unique and endless possibilities, as Sunny said. But if you click next, but this young man, who is my son, who is still only 7 years old, and he's still so adorably cute. But what happens when he becomes 20? What happens when he becomes 30, right? So we don't have problems seeing the worthiness, the invaluable, the pricelessness, the irreplaceable of a child. But when they grow up, it's gone. George Floyd was somebody's child, but he didn't see that. So even though we're all born worthy, we are also born vulnerable to having our dignity violated, right? But if we treat people with dignity, and that becomes the baseline of our interactions, you should not have to do anything to deserve it. If you go to the next slide. And so when we're talking about individual, interpersonal racism, individuals that on the side, interpersonal, how we interact with each other, individual, we have individual work that we need to do. Institutional and structural are really organizational practices, policies, systems, structures, right? I'm gonna talk about each piece, but really hit home the structural, because that is the piece that we have not dealt with in the United States. That is the piece, that is the reckoning that is unearthing, where policies need to be unearthed and changed, and structures, and some of the things that Tessa mentioned in terms of the future workforce. You know, if we don't prepare them, you're not gonna have a future workforce if we're not preparing them today and starting to change some of these structures and some of these institutional barriers that are at play. And so I'm gonna give you an example of one. Next slide. So if you could click, the light bulb. We all use them. It's in every one of our households, it's in every building. We can't do anything without the light, okay? And so tell me, who created the light bulb? If you could put it in the chat. Or what does the textbook say created the white light bulb? Very good, Milana. A Black man, you're right. But what does the textbook say? Edison, right? Thomas Edison. And you're right, Jen. So if you go, I know right there on McGregor Boulevard is Thomas Edison building. You do not see, if you go into the click next, this man, Henry Latimer, if you click next. Lewis Howard, not Henry, sorry. Lewis Howard Latimer was an American inventor, and he actually improved on Thomas Edison's original invention. You see the filament inside of the light? Thomas Edison's light bulbs didn't last long. It had a short lifespan. So Lewis Howard said, I can make it better. So he improved and patenting the use of carbon filament, which made possible for widespread use of electric light in public and at home. This is our silent history. It is not in our textbook. Our children do not learn this. And this is not Black history. This is American history. This is global history, because the light is being used across the globe. But however, this gentleman here does not get any type of credit or acknowledgement. Because why? Because structurally, institutionally, how could Lewis Howard Latimer improve Thomas Edison's original invention? You see? And so we have to unsilence the history. part of that is this should be part of American history. It should be instituted in every school system across the world, not just the United States, across the world. Yes, learn American, that's correct. Exactly, Sonny. It's been white-centric. And the point is, history should be people-centric. All of the people of color, white, black, brown, all of it, tell the truth. We need to unsilence, yes, white male-centric, that is correct. We need to unsilence our history. And part of my job is to unsilence it every time I share this slide. Every time I communicate, I'm unsilencing the history. Now then it's up to you to take that information into your areas so that kids can know the truth. Because what is great is, you can look at it as terms of teamwork. You have one person that started the design, another person said, I improved the design. It doesn't take away from Thomas Edison. If anything, it adds. But somehow, because he's a Black man, that is not an addition to our history. Next slide. And so when we look at American history, you look at Gordon's scourged back 400 years ago in slavery, and you look at the knee on George Floyd's neck. We are not far. Every event has an echo from the past. So although we're 400 years from Gordon's scourged back, look, now we're dealing with the knee on the neck and the knee on justice. And so with the devaluation of Black lives, we need to change that term and talk about, my CEO said, all lives does not matter until Black lives matter too. So we can't say all and not include the lives that have been dealing with this 400 years of this American slavery, segregation, and all the echoes of the past. Because of course, all lives matter. It's not about a slogan or a tagline or a flyer or whatever. It is about the structure in which the structure has been designed. And this is the time for us to make those changes. If you go into the next slide. And so why is it so challenging to honor people's dignity? Well, because we are born with it, but we don't know, we're not born on how to act like it, okay? It says all wrongdoing arises because of the mind. If mind is transferred, can wrongdoing remain? Yes, included, yeah, word, Black matters, yep, matters too. That is correct, Sonny. It is easy to discriminate against someone who is different from you. Every human being is capable of violating dignity. We have to take the shame out of admitting that, okay? We have to take the shame out of it and in terms of self-preservation to justify our behavior. We need to we have blind spots that we're not very aware of and which can sometimes justify our own undignified behavior. So one of the things I often say is, and if you go to the next slide, is you have to plant the right seeds. So our biases are most likely activated by 5 key conditions: similarity, the tendency to view people who look or think like us more favorably; expedience, the tendency to rush to conclusions in an effort to minimize cognitive effort; experience, the tendency to believe that how we see the world is inherently truer than someone else's perspective; distance, the tendency to assign greater value to those things we perceive to be close to us rather than further away; safety, the tendency to over-account for negative outcomes instead of positive ones. And so in a story that I will share is, I experienced this similarity, experience, and distance. The tendency to view people who look or think more favorably than people who are different. So prior to me moving to Florida, I used to, and as Tessa alluded in the story, I used to live and work in Japan. And when I applied for the job, and Martha has heard this story quite a lot, I used to use this story a lot at Lee. But when I applied to the job, I picked Kyoto, Osaka, and Tokyo, because I did not want to live in a rural part of Japan. I felt like living in the city will be better for me, because I knew that there wouldn't probably be a lot of people that looked like me who lived in the rural part of Japan. Well, they did not give me that. They gave me Shiga, which is in Wani, which is rural Japan. So the school was on top of Mount Harai, and monkeys used to invade the school. Lake Biwako is the largest lake in Japan. So they, talking about fishermen community. And I had rice fields around my apartment because they raised rice. The best tasting rice I've ever tasted in my life. But I said, this is not gonna work. I said, this is not gonna work, because I just felt uncomfortable because the distance and the experience, I didn't have experience with that, being in a foreign country that, well, I did have experience being in a foreign country, but being so far away from what may not be anyone that looked like me or familiarity. So I had my own bias. They too had their bias. Now, mind you, this was a year-long process. I had to interview with the embassy, had to have certain grades, had to have all these credentialing. But when they saw my picture on my application, they said, what? How can she can't teach our kids. Because I was actually a teacher. I taught ESOL, junior high school. And they said, this is not gonna work. Mind you, I had all the credentials, but it's the picture that said, it's not gonna work. Because their perception of me is based on stereotypes and not me as a person. However, if you go to the next slide, I went. And you can see me right there. Of course, you can find me easily in that group. And they called me O Sensei because my name is way too long for them. And if you see the person I'm looking at the screen to my right, so it's probably to your left, his name was Kengo Takayama. And Kengo Takayama came to me one day. I was in a teacher's lounge doing, teacher's room, doing my work. And he said, "Oh, Sensei, I looked up the word black in the dictionary and it said dark, gloomy, evil. But that's not you. You're a ray of sunshine." And so I'm trying to, push back tears. He was 13 years old. And he didn't understand why the word in the dictionary did not reflect who I was as a person. He was 13 years old in rural Japan. So I had the most philosophical conversation with this young boy about the difference. He later wrote an essay and said because of his experience with me, he now wants to see the world. So imagine if Japan said, no, we don't want her, or what if I said, no, I'm not going there. You see, we got to plant the right seeds. And planting the right seeds is based on our communication, is based on how we interact, is based on dignity. He saw me as worthy, and he was conflicted because the words in the dictionary did not describe the worthiness of who I was to him. That is what we do when we lead with dignity. If you go to the next slide. And so competition reduces empathy. Research, Dr. Sakara says, when you actually work with people, diverse groups, it actually increases empathy. So if you think about sports teams, Olympics, you think about those engagement, because it reduces the unknowns. Actually, there was a Harvard study, I believe it was Harvard, where they showed people who dorm with each other and they're from different backgrounds, whether religion, race. They said that person who actually dorms with somebody outside of their group, they have a totally different understanding when they leave the university, because it now opens their world to a world that they weren't familiar with prior. And their bias calculator goes down. It actually goes down. And then also, if you look at the next slide, it shows, showing people integrating social networks. So if we have social networks that are integrated, here it shows polarization. So you see, I'm on this camp, you're in this camp. But when we actually integrate and work together, it creates a connection point. So Dr. Sakara was saying, it doesn't mean that you all have to agree. It doesn't mean you all have to have the same religion or same ideologies. What it means, it increases knowledge sharing, increases communication, it increases empathy and understanding. And empathy is part of dignity. It's part of dignity because you're able to put yourself in that person's shoes. Next slide. And so you need to explore your ugly, okay? Yes, it does. If you're open, you're absolutely right. It does go down, absolutely. Part of leading with dignity is exploring your ugly truth, right? So keep going. So your fears, your challenges, are you planting the right seeds as a leader? Keep going. What you think of yourself may not be what others think of you, so it takes some internal self-exploration. Keep going. And your technical ability does not mean you equals leadership ability. People need to get that. Leadership is a class by itself. Just because you have letters by your name does not make you a leader. It's a whole nother class by itself. If you keep going. And so you need to exercise your dignity muscle. It is a lifelong learning. So that's why I said part of the work, in order to get to the structural piece, you need to do the internal first. So watch for judgments. Why am I thinking that way? Why did I feel that way? Be curious, look for opportunities to expand your understanding with each other. Maybe do lunch and learns with each other or cultural nights, whatever that is that in your sphere of influence. Eliminate the word failure. I hear that a lot. People are afraid to say anything. I don't want to say anything wrong. But, failure only means to do something different. So if you do say something wrong, that's okay. It's about doing something different. And that's what I like about the dignity model, because that manager was able to right the wrong. He was able to do something differently because he failed once, but he didn't fail twice. And don't take feedback as criticism, rather as a growth opportunity. Next slide. And so you have to build a dignity consciousness. If you click next, Dr. Donna Hicks, she stated next, she says, leaders play a critical role at bringing out the best in people. They need to know how to honor the dignity of people, as well as create policies that are sensitive to dignity issues. Leaders do this by modeling dignified behaviors, by creating culture that is mindful of the impact and effect that it has on all employees. So that's a direct quote. Next slide. And so, it starts with you. You gotta take responsibility. We are hardwired for self-preservation. Oh, I don't wanna look bad in front of this person. I don't wanna say something. No, we are in a different state of mind right now, and we need to increase our own understanding of our role that we're playing in this. And so dignity of consciousness allows us to override those instincts. And doing so, you maintain your own dignity because it starts with you. Next slide. And so when you think about it, keep going. You need to build your character equity. I love what Dr. Martin Luther King said. He said, the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. And so when I said, if you go to the next slide, it's a lifelong learning, and you see in the picture, there's books, that's great, but practice create wins. In order to honor dignity, you gotta practice it. You gotta practice it, and I know Tessa's gonna send the dignity model to all of you, and it's a daily practice. Within my organization, they've actually adapted the dignity model in our culture pillar because it's worked so well within the organization, and especially in dealing with difficult conversations in difficult teams, but even the teams that who may not have had those challenges, it actually elevated the way that they treated each other, which then translated to the way they treat their patients. And so that we've been seeing some really positive gains around dignity within Bay State. Next slide. And so we need to raise your dignity conscious. So how do you do that? So I'm going to show you some examples of what we did at Bay State to talk about that. Okay, save the file from the chat. Thanks, Tessa. So one of the things in response to George Floyd, we actually created Elevating Dignity Education Series. So we have this, whenever you see elevating the D, we're elevating dignity within our organization. So we started with leading with dignity, what managers can do right now, elevating dignity, the power of dignity in the workplace, what employees can do right now, dignity cafes, and that's from leaders who've actually used a dignity model and has been successful with it. You know, bring your cup of coffee and tea and let's talk, real talk. Shifting the narrative, let's talk about race. We're actually launching that next week. And how to be a workplace ally, be an ambassador for change, which has been awesome. All my classes have been sold out, if that's the appropriate word to use, full to capacity as it relates to the response. And it's really helped the internal work, but as well as the external work, the systemic work that we need to do within the organization. Next slide. And so what we're doing at Bay State is we're dismantling structural, institutional racism. We're creating a wrecking ball to the structure, okay? Because the structures were built within an inequity lens. So you gotta rebuild. You gotta start from scratch. And so if you go to the next slide, how you do that is through structural inclusion. So Tessa talked about structural racism, right? I like to talk about, which is exactly the point, structural inclusion is the opposite of structural racism. So I want to call the thing that I want to see. That's why, because we've been using the word racism, structural racism, much longer than we've been using the word structural inclusion. So I want to call what I want to see. And what structural inclusion says, it looks at equitable structures, practices, policies, and algorithms within your organization. And then you have behavioral inclusion, which is the training, inclusive mindsets, decisions, relationships, which drives change. It drives change. So you need both in order to create that systemic structural change. Next slide. And so at Bay State, she asked me to talk about some of the things that we started. So I have a structural inclusion committee. And you can see this was our first meeting we had in December 2019. December 2019. So before anything happened over the summer, before COVID, we've been meeting every month. And what we're doing is uncovering a lot of things that we want to change. We're breaking down systemic barriers, and we're ensuring a bias-free decision-making that purposely builds equity across the entire employee experience. Next slide. And this is our DEI strategic plan. And so when I got at Bay State, that was the first, I did my 90-day review and interviewing and surveying and analyzing and came up with this plan in which Bay State had adopted. Now, of course, depending on where you are, I know some of you are with Lee County Education on the board, you know, there's things, do you have a strategic plan? What does that look like? And Bay State, it has adopted it as an overarching plan. So it's not just Yemisi doing it, it is the organizational's responsibility because everybody plays a role and a part. My job is to be the influencer, the person to knowledge share, and maybe sometimes I need to be the person to push certain things along, obviously, and to be the collaborator, but everybody plays a critical role in this process. Next slide. And so part of this work is people don't want talk anymore. That's why in this, it says, don't talk, just act. Don't say, just show. Don't promise, just prove, because your actions are remembered long after your words are forgotten. Next slide. And so has coined the phrase dignity, character, respect. Very good. I'm glad that you did that. That's awesome. And that dignity model, Gwinnetta, will work really well with a lot of things that you're trying to do, will work really well. So I wanted to say this too, because oftentimes people who say, well, why should I care about diversity, equity, inclusion, right? Well, if you think about the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, because when we elevate the dignity for one, we actually elevate the dignity for all. All of us have been impacted by the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. You have wider doors. I'm sure every single one of you have pressed the handicap button because maybe you had a number of bags, or maybe you had a child in a stroller, or maybe you were taking care of someone. Whatever that is, you pressed that button. We have wider walkways and streets, leveling of counters. Maybe you're horizontally a challenge, or if you think about children. And think about the time that, God forbid, something happens to you, that you are still able to be employed. So when we elevate the dignity for one, we elevate the dignity for all. Next slide. And so we need to think about that. We need to think about what within our structures and our institutions in which everyone is not equitable. Because when you fix the inequities for one group, you actually make the system better. It's not that you're taking away, you're actually adding and making it better. Next slide. And so this is the book, Leading with Dignity by Dr. Donna Hicks, that I've been using within Bay State, How to Create a Culture That Brings Out the Best in People. It is an amazing book, easy read, get it from Amazon. We're doing, our leadership is actually bought these books, some of our leaders, and they're doing leadership discussions and roundtables around it, and tying it to the strategy and how we need to do and elevate the work. If you could go to the next slide. And so, I love, I don't know why it's showing like this, but if you can go to the next slide, Tessa, for some reason it didn't go as planned. But I wanted to say here to end, the quote basically talks about how the pandemic that we're in right now forces us to do things differently. We cannot go back to the way we're doing things. Yes, someone else does not. Yes, it does not decrease your dignity. In fact, increases your dignity. That's correct, Gwinnetta. And so we need to be inclusion architects, okay? We are building a house. So when you think about these people that are building that house and holding that wall up, everybody plays a role and a part. Whether you're building a house or whether you're building an organization, whether you're building students, whether you're working in healthcare, whatever your role or in the community, the point is you are an inclusion architect and we are building a house. But it starts with dignity, because dignity, when you apply dignity, it actually elevates respect. You actually elevate it, because dignity, as we remember, is that you are worthy. Next slide. And so I thank you for this time with me today. The other slide talked about some action items. For some reason, it messed up. But I wanted to take the time to entertain any, thank you, Sunny, entertain any questions that you may have in relations to things that you want to do. I know Tessa is going to send out the dignity model. As I said, we've adopted it within Bay State. And there's so many things that we've done, in particularly within COVID. Thank you, Tessa. We have done a lot in our community related to, thank you, Granetta, creating social distancing pack. We did a cultural responsive survey. We did a lot in relations to, and soon to be writing a white paper. I'm part of the research team, so you'll hear more. So again, I really, really, really enjoy my time at Bay State, but it all started at Lee Health in Lee County. Thank you. Oh, she said dignity models in the chat. Hopeful and so timely. Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Julie. I remember you. Thank you all. Any questions that you may have?
So if you do have questions, go ahead and ask. I'm going to put our next conversations and an evaluation survey link in the chat. So please go ahead and click on those, but go ahead and feel free to unmute and ask your questions.
Hi, I just wanted to say hi, MC. So good to see you. Do you talk as well about the I don't know what to call it, but when a person of color, you kind of touched on it at one point, has this lack of dignity from people that don't look like them, and a lack of dignity from people that look like them at the same time. And I know you've experienced that. How do you navigate that? Can't hear you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Grenetta, that's a great question. Yes, I did experience that, particularly moving here and, you know, having my name or being, you know, immigrant Nigerian family. You know, there were some convo around that in the initial stage when I started the work, especially around DEI at Lee Health, where some felt like it shouldn't have been given to me. That job it should have been given to someone local. Yeah. Someone locally who was from there. Yeah. So I did go through that. And Gwinnetta, what changed is I didn't change, because what happens is that is designed to make you feel like start questioning yourself, and is designed to kind of, sometimes you may feel like you need to acquiesce at points. And what I realize is I'm not acquiescing. I came here for a job and I was chosen for a reason. And so I remained authentically myself. And over time, that changed. The relationship changed over time. I think there was a misunderstanding. They didn't know who I was, and they needed to see the authenticity over time. And being, as you all know, being involved with a lot of community engagement work, particularly pennies for community, that was a really big one. And being part of Progressive Women and so many things really helped to show my authenticity in a different light. So I would say, do not change who you are. You are chosen for that role for a reason. And, you know, they will get over it. that's I could say, but I understand. Any other questions?
Well, this was such a gift to have you with us again today. If you ever want to come back and try out anything else on us,
Yeah.
we're here as your test subjects. It was really fantastic to see the work that you're doing still.
Yes.
In the chat is the Dignity Model PDF that you can download. We also I also put the next 3 introductions to conversations about structural racism and implicit bias. So if you can't get to the one that's tomorrow morning at 9, there are 2 more for you to choose from. And our goal is to get as many people in Southwest Florida to be part of those conversations so that we can create that brave space in our community to have the ongoing conversations together that lead to those changes in the structure to create structural inclusion.
Yes.
And then also there's a link that takes you to like a 2-minute survey. We love your feedback. We're to the end of our equity and COVID conversations. We definitely want to have more. So if you have suggestions or thoughts, we want to know what you thought of today and what you think we should do going forward. And with that, I just want to say thank you all for your attention and your participation and for joining us. And thank you again, Yemisi. We appreciate and love you.
Yeah, I miss you guys.
Yeah. And so with that, I'm going to sign off, and everybody,
Yes.
I hope you have a fantastic day, and definitely keep in touch with each other, because we have to stick together
Yeah.
to get to that better future. So
That
we'll
is
see you
true.
later.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. Bye.